Hi, I'm Kelly, and this is another easy video for beginners. I'm going to show you 4 different ways to apply color and then 3 different wash techniques. As you try them, you'll see how gorgeous watercolor can be. So let's get started. First, I'm going to demonstrate 4 ways you can apply color, and they all involve the words wet or dry in some way. This one is called wet into wet. It's the most fluid, unpredictable way to paint, and some would say it's the most beautiful. As you can see, I'm wetting the rectangle with water using a big flat brush, and while it's still wet, I'll be dropping wet paint into it. I'm painting with a range of blues here, and you can use whatever colors you like. The way they explode and bloom on the paper brings me so much joy. I'm just doing some abstract shapes and blobs. We're not trying to make a finished picture with these, we just want to experiment with the paints. The setup for this project is the same as last time. I traced around postcards to create 8 rectangles, and I taped them in pairs to 4 small pieces of cardboard. You can make your rectangles any size you like, and you can do them all on a single sheet of paper or spread it out over several. It's important that you tape your paper securely to a board, and today I'm using cardboard. Back to the painting, wet into wet is ideal for skies or anywhere you want large, soft areas of color. I also use it as underpainting. After it dries, or while it's still kind of wet, I layer paint on top of it and add details. The second way you can apply paint is called wet on dry, also known as direct painting. This is the way most beginners instinctively use watercolor, a wet brush on dry paper. It's safer than wet into wet because the color stays where you put it. I'm using magenta, hot pink, and orange for this. All of them are blazingly bright, and few things make me happier than laying colors like this on the paper and just watching them glow. You can see how the edges between the colors blur a bit, but not as much as they would if I had painted water over this rectangle first. After I finished painting the wet on dry here, I noticed some paint pooling in the wet into wet. You can tip your board to help the paint flow. The wet into wet paint will continue to evolve as it dries, and this is what it looks like after a couple of hours. As you can see, there's quite a difference. Meanwhile, the wet on dry stays pretty much the same. Next up is dry brush, or dry on dry. I'm using the minimum amount of water necessary to get paint on my brush, and I often dab the excess on a paper towel before I begin painting. I hold my brush perpendicular to the paper and sweep it across. The paint stays on the raised surface of the paper, and the little nooks and crannies stay white. You can see specks of paper showing through the paint. The paint will stay exactly where you put it and won't run together. This technique is used for creating rough textures like bark, and you could also use it when painting a lake sparkling in the sun. Experiment with dry brush using different kinds of brushes, and vary the amount of pressure that you put on the brush as you paint. You can press down hard, you can scrub, you can drag it across, or you can dust with it. My small fuzzy brush can make soft, cotton candy-like textures, and I typically do this on top of areas that already have some dried paint on top of them. Dry brush is about as close to drawing as you can get and still be painting. The last way to apply color is dry on wet. Many painters use this method the most, and I do it too sometimes. It's a nice way to combine the control of wet on dry painting with the fresh randomness of wet into wet. First, I'm covering the surface with some cerulean blue. Again, you can use whatever colors you like. Next, I'll be mixing a dull yellow gold to go on top. The gold is going to be thicker and drier than the cerulean paint that I just put down. And I'm using a mixture of yellow, brown, orange, and purple. Then I'll be applying this relatively thick paint to the wet surface of the paper. It stays put, sort of, but the edges become fuzzy and soft. If I wanted the edges to be less fuzzy, I would have waited a little bit longer for the cerulean to become drier. See what happens when you add concentrated paint to the surface? You'll notice that it won't move or fade as much as paint containing more water. Something about this technique reminds me of spray painting. This is what these methods look like when they're dry. The dry brush hasn't changed, but the dry on wet has. In the second part of this exercise, you'll get to try 3 different washes. A wash is simply a thin, diluted layer of color, sometimes applied over a large area. The first kind is a flat wash, which is deceptively simple. You would think that painting a solid, flat rectangle of color would be easy, but if you direct paint it, that's wet paint on a dry surface, you'll probably get some streaks, especially if you use a small brush. My tip is to wet down the area with water first, then add your paint using the largest brush you feel comfortable using. You want the surface to be visibly wet but not full of huge puddles. The water will help your color spread and flow, and as it dries, everything seems to even out. Normally, I paint a flat wash in one direction, but for the sake of demonstration, I thought I'd show you what would happen if you painted it in more than one direction. No matter how messy you get, the water is pretty forgiving. Since most of my paintings are loaded with hundreds of small sections, I don't have to do lots of big flat washes, and that's a good thing because something about them makes me nervous. Tipping your board can help your flat wash become more even too, and it's always fun to watch darker paint fuzz out into lighter areas. Once you've painted any kind of wash, just leave it alone until it dries. Don't go into it while it's still wet and try to correct things. Ultimately, all you'll do is make it worse, believe me. The next wash is a gradated or graded wash. I just think of it as a fade. This is where the paint is more intense on one side of the paper and it gradually blends out to nothing on the other side. Here's the easiest way to do it. First, wet down the entire surface with water. The surface should be visibly wet, but with no big puddles. Then load your brush. You don't want clots of paint here and there on the brush, just bright, slightly diluted color. I'm using turquoise because this is an excellent way to create a convincing cloudless blue sky. Then, tilting the board a bit, I'm dragging the paint across the page, left to right, while moving down. The brush runs out of paint and gravity helps everything blend together softly. It's really fun to watch this happen, and you can move the board in other directions if things are looking too stripy. I'm going to absorb that bead of water at the bottom with a dry brush, and then I'm going to leave it alone until it's totally dry. And here's what the flat wash and the fade look like after a couple of hours. The final wash is so much fun that we're going to do it twice. It's called a variegated wash, and I frequently use small versions of this kind of wash for underpainting. What we have here is a wet surface, and I'm going to drop several very different colors into it, wet into wet style. On this one I'm using yellow, blue, and brown, just dropping them in there randomly and watching them interact. This kind of thing only happens in watercolor. If I were an oil painter, I'd be jealous of this. Oil paint just can't achieve this kind of randomness. It's impossible to totally predict how these effects will turn out. The dried end product is often wildly different from the wet version, but that's also part of its charm. I'm adding more intense paints here and there, and it continues to bloom and explode like fireworks. Nothing is lovelier than this, if you ask me. And now I'm tipping the board. Look at those colors flowing together. Don't do this too much or you will end up with a single, often muddy color. But wow, it's so tempting to just keep playing with this. So let's do it one more time with different colors. Again, I'm painting the surface with water, and be sure you change your water often. Something about the lighting here is making it look like I'm painting with coffee, but I'm not. Now I'm going to drop in magenta, orange, and purple. If you get lucky here, you might like one of these little experiments so much that you want to frame it. Watercolor is just so gorgeous and flowy and soft, and while everything here is happening mostly by accident, if the watercolor surprises you and does something you really like, just let people think that you knew what you were doing and you meant for it to turn out like that. No one needs to know the truth. I mean, you can see why a person like me would want to quit her day job to do this full time, right? I've been painting with watercolor since 1986, and I still can't get over the amazing things it can do. I mean, just look at it. And here's what the variegated washes look like when they're dry. As you can see, the colors really fade, so don't be afraid to use intense colors. Also, if you feel like you messed up on any of these mini paintings, don't give up. You should definitely try them again. I hope you'll enjoy doing these exercises with me, and please join me again for the next video in our beginner series.